A bold new theory in neuroscience called predictive processing has changed our understanding of what the brain does. Uh, that new understanding is promising to unify topics all across neuroscience and psychology. The purpose of the predictive classroom is to begin to explore the implications of that new understanding for education, for what happens in the classroom, for what it is that we do to help our students go forward in the world. Now, if you look at this, some might see a child acquiring new knowledge and skills, but there's actually far more going on. Really, what you are looking at here is a child in the process of becoming a different person as they construct for themselves a richer, more elaborate experiential world. As educators, our job is to facilitate that process. That is, what we do is we guide students by preparing experiences that help them construct richer, more expansive, more meaningful versions of themselves and the worlds they inhabit. The starting point for understanding this is to look at perception. Perception isn't just the world coming to us through our senses. Perception is actually something that happens when our prior experiences and knowledge of the world come together with new information from the world. So how does that work? Well, the easiest way to see that to start is with a couple of examples. If we really perceive the world as it is, then previous experiences shouldn't change what we see, because after all, we're just perceiving the world, and yet they do. Look at this for a minute. What do you perceive? Think it likely that all you perceive here are a bunch of kind of black and white splotches. But now, look at this for a minute. Look at it long and hard. Two students hard at work, head to head. And now look at the original again. Now what do you perceive? I suspect it's changed. Now in what was just a bunch of blotches, there are those two students. So what changed? Well, the only thing that changed were your prior expectations. Seeing that other image changed the way that you perceive this one. Can you unsee it? Can you look at that now and only see the blotches? Probably not, because that experience with what this image represents is now part of your perception. Here we go. These are a couple of kids from East Bay, Montessori in the Bay Area. Anyway, I understand that these kids are real geography geeks, and they're going to think it's cool that their faces showed up on a presentation that right now is about to be presented in Bangkok. How do perceptions work? Another thing is that if we really perceive the world, then our prior knowledge of the world wouldn't change what we see. Again, if the world is the world and it's just coming to us through our senses, that's it. And yet our prior knowledge does change what we see. Look at these two squares. Compare their colors. They're exactly the same. But now what happens if we take these two squares and we put them in a different context? Now those two squares are part of a checkerboard. Square B is sitting there in the shadow of the cylinder. If you look at those, they're exactly the same two squares, but now I assure you that you see A as being darker than B. If we just perceive the world, they're the same color. Objectively, they're the same color. So again, what has changed? The thing that's changed is your knowledge about the world. You know about checkerboards and shadows and all of those things, and that knowledge of the world changes the way that you perceive. Again, can you make yourself see those two squares as the same color? I strongly doubt that you can. Our perceptions are constructed. Perception is what happens when prior experience and knowledge come together with information from the world. Taking this a bit further, understanding why this really matters, I want to introduce a metaphor, and that metaphor is the metaphor of a black box. A black box is an idea from science that a black box is just something that you can't know directly. You can't know what's inside a black box. All that you can do is guess about the contents. The question is, how do we guess what's inside the black box? The answer is, we make a guess. We use that guess to make predictions. We then test those predictions. Maybe we pick it up, we shake it, we rattle it, whatever. Based on those, we refine our guess. And around and around and around we go until finally we come up with a best guess of what's inside the box. Okay, you can ask how good is the guess. The only way to know for sure is to open it. So you open the black box. Who knows what's inside? Okay. To the brains, our world is a black box. That is, if you think about it, the brain's sitting there in the skull. It's dark in there. It's quiet. The brain has no direct access to the world. All the brain has are signals coming in and out through some nerve fibers. And yet somehow we perceive the world. The world is in a black box. The difference is that this time we don't get to open it to see what's inside. We're stuck with nothing but our best guess. What predictive processing tells us is that that best guess is the only thing that we can ever perceive about the world. So how does the brain do the guessing? The brain actually does the guessing very much the same way that we tried to figure out what was inside the black box above. It perceives the world by making and testing predictions. This idea, a rapidly developing neuroscientific framework called predictive processing, is providing new clarity about how the brain constructs its best guess about the world, its perceptions about the world, of ourselves and others, how we construct the world that we experience. The core of this is the realization that your brain is constantly maintaining and updating a predictive model of the world. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, what your brain is doing is sitting there using about 20% of your body's total energy, and this is what it's doing with it. It's modeling the world. Now, modeling is a little bit of a technical term. We're not talking about this kind of a model. We're not talking about this kind of a model. When we talk about the model of your brain, we're talking about something that's more like this kind of a model, more like a weather model. And what that weather model does is it takes all of the available information, everything it knows about the world, and then asks the question, what's going on out there and what should happen next? Our weather model predicts. Here's how weather models work. Start with a big computer. You take physics and chemistry and everything that you know about how things work in the world. You combine that with prior information about temperatures, winds, what's the water vapor doing, precipitation, all of that, and you put it together and you turn the crank. Basically, you use your understanding of how the model works to take the facts that you know about the world and turn it into a best guess about what's actually going on. So there you go. You've got your model. Your model is making predictions. It's offering up a best guess. Then what you do is you compare those predictions with actual weather data, and you use the differences to update the model, and then you do it again. And around and around and around you go. That's how weather models work. It turns out that's also how your brain works. That what your brain does is your brain takes everything that you know about the world. It takes prior information about, okay, what information do I have? What signals coming in through eyes, ears, from my body, all of that stuff. And from that, it constructs a best guess about the world around you. This is not a video of Earth's weather. This is a predictive weather model's evolving best guess about Earth's weather systems. What we perceive is not the world directly, but rather what we perceive is our brain's evolving best guess about the world and what's happening. Your perceptions do not show you what's really happening around you. In fact, your perceptions show you your brain's evolving best guess about what's happening around you. You might want to pause the video for a minute and think about it, because this is a deep, maybe kind of difficult idea, but it's profound. It changes the way we think about our experiences. To understand what's going on here, we have to dip our toes a little bit into the neuroscience that I mentioned before, predictive processing. Starting point is just to ask a little bit about what the brain is doing. If I show you a picture of the brain and the senses and ask how much information flows which direction, you might imagine that the answer is obvious, that, well, the senses are getting information from the world and they're passing it on to the brain. Why would you need to send information from the brain back to the senses? Yeah, maybe you'd think it's about the same. I doubt that you would have started by saying that more information is flowing from the brain toward the senses than from the senses back toward the brain. And yet that's exactly what is happening. There's much more information flowing from your brain toward your senses than from your senses toward your brain. Here's what's going on. Just like we talked about above, your brain has a model of the world. It's using that model to make predictions about what information should be coming in from the senses, just like the weather model did. The only thing that needs to flow back in the other direction are the errors in the predictions. So if you get it right, nothing needs to happen, but if your predictions are wrong, then the senses tell you that. The brain is a prediction machine. But what the brain is always doing is predicting the world and then trying to minimize the error signals to make its model of the world as well as possible predict things that match the incoming information. All right, objective reality, that thing that we might think we perceive. Objective reality is the thing that exists independent of our perceptions. Objective reality is out there, but if we've seen objective reality is in a black box, we can't know objective reality directly. Instead, we've got our brain with its model. By the way, the model is also in a black box. The model is running subconsciously. You know, in the weather model, you didn't see all of the calculations connecting this temperature with this wind speed or any of that. All you got to see was your brain's best guess. Or pardon me, the weather model's best guess. It's the same with your brain. We can't perceive the world. We can't directly perceive our model. What we can perceive is the brain's best guess. So here's what's going on. You've got your model. Your model is making predictions about incoming data. In this case, objective reality is a pyramid, or your model is a pyramid. The predictions are okay, so you don't need to send error signals back to the brain. And your brain offers up its constructed best guess based on its model and those error signals. That's your perception. Your perception is the brain's best guess. That's the only reality you can ever experience. But now what happens if objective reality changes? If something in the world changes? Well, okay, our pyramid now becomes a sphere. It's no longer the case that the sphere and the model match well, which means that the senses start generating error signals. There's a mismatch between the predictions and the incoming information. And so the brain starts trying to make those error signals go away by changing its model. So it changes its model. All right, this isn't sharp and square, it's more roundish, and well, okay, it's round all the way around. Okay, that's getting closer, things are getting better. All right, here's a model, and this model actually seems to do a pretty good job of predicting what's actually coming in from the senses. The senses aren't offering up errors anymore. We've minimized the error signals, and so the brain offers up a new constructed best guess. Your new perception, your new experienced reality. That's a snapshot of how we predictively perceive the world. Now, okay, educators, the model here happens to be a Montessori geometrical sphere. That's what was out there. That was the reality we constructed. But remember, in testing those predictions, we use all of the available information. If we're in a Montessori classroom, then, boy, everything that we see and know says, yeah, that's a Montessori sphere. We got it. But what would happen if instead you saw that very same geometrical solid, that very same sphere, sitting there on a pool table in a pool hall? There's a lot of information here about where you are, what's going on, what you might expect. Your brain uses all of that information to make and minimize those predictions. And so it's very likely that if you saw that Montessori sphere sitting there on a pool table, what you would actually see, what you would perceive, would be a 2-ball. The brain might have constructed a very different reality than the objective reality that's out there. And that perceived reality is never perfect. It can actually be wildly wrong. There's one way that the brain has to reduce errors in its predictions. It can change its model. That process is what we call perception. But there's another way that the brain can change can reduce the errors in predictions, and that is it can change the world. It can take action. It can predict actions. Actions and perceptions work in exactly the same way. Here, we've got our brain as predicting an outcome. That outcome is that you have grasped the tennis ball. But in the world, that hasn't happened, which means that there are error signals coming back. The real world, the information from the world doesn't match your expectations, your predictions. And so what your brain does is minimize the error signals, this time not by changing the model, but by changing the world. It minimizes the error signals until finally the error signals go away and you're holding onto the ball. Those action perception loops, making predictions, taking actions, perceiving, are how we come to know the world. You can really see that when you look at a baby learning. How does a baby build their early predicted model of the world? If you've ever watched a baby play, which I strongly suspect that you have, the baby's limbs are kind of going every which direction and all of that stuff as they look at the toy or whatever it is that has their attention. Do you ever notice that when the baby finally manages to grab that toy for the first time, they just laugh and they're excited, and boy, that's great? The reason is that they were making predictions, they were moving, and suddenly by moving, they were changing their perceptions. They build their model of the world by building a model that says, when I send these signals out, these signals come back in, and they start to be able to predict that. They start to be able to know that. That's how they build the world. And that's a cool thing. Now, there's another way to answer this question. How does a baby build their perceptions of the world? Well, according to Cahan et al. In the Journal of Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience, published, I believe, in 1922, if I remember correctly, they do it by using predictive models that are organized through a hierarchy of increasingly complex hypotheses about the states of the world. I'm not going to dig into that other than to remind you that everything that we're talking about here, these aren't kind of speculations, these aren't just kind of ideas about what might be going on. That what we're talking about here is neuroscience. It's backed up by hard evidence. So what's your brain doing at this very moment? Your brain is running a model of the world and using it to make predictions. That's where 20% of your body's energy is going constantly. It's then minimizing the errors in those predictions, either by changing its model, perception, or by changing the world, action. In the process, it is constructing your world. It's constructing you. It's constructing the only things that you will ever perceive, feel, or experience. Now, let's bring a new layer of complexity here. Humans are the social ape. There is nothing more important to humans than social connections. It's by acting as groups that we manage to find ourselves on top of the food chain. But if you think about it, how do you get there? Because here you are with your model inside its black box, and there's the world out there in its black box, and then there's another person there, and in that person they've got their own black box that's running their model of the world. So how is it that we can somehow get through all of those levels of ambiguity, of prediction, all of those nested black boxes, and still actually communicate, collaborate, empathize with another person? Here's what the social world is like. Everybody has their own internal model of the world. Everybody is going about there, if you've got a bunch of people in a room, they share the same objective room, but there are as many different perceptual rooms as there are people in there. To communicate with other people, to be able to bridge all of that, it helps if you have some prior understanding of what might be going on in there. If you can make some assumptions about what are their values, about what is it that they know, how do they communicate, how do you use language, how do they communicate? If you're going to work with someone else, have any relationship with someone else, then you need a guide, you need commonality in the way that the two of you are constructing your worlds. We call that commonality culture. Culture writ large, the culture between different countries, the culture in a big sense. But even if you get two people together in a room and ask them to do a job, the only way that they can do that thing together is if they manage to build a common culture between them. Working with others is impossible without common culture. And that goes both directions. That doesn't mean me trying to understand your culture or you trying to understand my culture. It means the two of us working together to share elements of culture that then allow us to communicate, to work together. Our brain's model of the world constructs our lived reality. That's what we've been talking about. But what shapes our constructed predictive model of the world? Well, that takes it into the classroom. This is a beautiful example. If you look at that, these are Montessori graded cylinders. All you have to do is watch a child and you can see this process in action. That child is predicting that that cylinder will fit snugly in that hole, and yet when they put that cylinder in the hole, it doesn't fit snugly. Now, instead of staying put when they try to move it, it rattles around. Certainly, if they try to take the other cylinder and put it in the other hole, it's not going to fit at all. So that child is making predictions about what their perceptions will be when they take certain actions. And right now, those predictions are wrong. There are error signals coming back. And so what that child is going to do is that child is going to act in the world, put that cylinder in different holes until finally the information coming back in agrees with predictions. And in the process, that child is building their model of the world. That child is learning motor control. That child is becoming a new person. Take that into a classroom. You, as the educator, as the guide, there's a tendency to think you are you and the students are the students. But actually, you as a guide are not perceiving the classroom as it is. Remember, you're perceiving your brain's best guess about what the classroom is. The child isn't perceiving the classroom directly either. The child is perceiving their best guess about what's in the classroom. And guess what? That best guess is not the same as your best guess. The room that the child is perceiving and the room that you are perceiving, the everything that the child is perceiving, is different from your perceptions, and it's different for every child in the room. Education is about guiding the child as they expand and develop that model that they use to construct their world, to construct their reality. Now, that deeper understanding always brings with it richer practice. It would be a long presentation. We'll address this in other content. It always brings richer practice. The thing that I want to stress right now, though, is the importance of this, because we kind of have an idea, again, that there's a student sitting there, we're giving the student knowledge, skills, whatever. That's not what's going on. Think about it this way. If the only thing that you have to build with are sticks, then what you can build is pretty limited. Then all that you can construct is something that's made out of sticks. If you want to build more elaborate and diverse worlds, then you need more than sticks. You need different materials, you need tools, you need know-how, you need all of that kind of stuff. It's the same with us, with our students, with ourselves, that if we cannot build perceptions, we cannot build experiences, we cannot build our worlds or ourselves unless we own the parts. You can't build with what you don't have. You can't build your world, yourself, with what you don't have. Education is about providing experiences that expand that model, that give us the new building materials, that let us live in a richer life. You can only build with what you have. Remember, the brain's constructed, evolving best guess about the world is the only thing that we can ever directly feel, perceive, experience. And that lived reality, including our experience of ourselves, can be no richer than the model that predicts it into existence. That's what education is about. Education isn't giving a child knowledge and skills. Education is about experiences that shape the child's immediate, experienced, felt, perceived reality. Education isn't about giving the child knowledge and skills. Education is about providing experiences through which the child becomes a different person living in a richer world. And that's what's happening in every classroom everywhere, whether you know it or not. Again, to emphasize, these statements are neuroscience. These statements are rooted in what the brain is actually doing. Now, this is a good time to be talking about this stuff. There have been a lot of really interesting books out recently, looking at the neuroscience end of things. Andy Clark's The Experience Machine, how our minds predict and shape reality, is a really good place to start understanding predictive processing. As goes perception, so go our emotions. We construct our emotions in exactly the same way. Lisa Feldman Barrett talks about that. Anil Seth, in his book Being You, talks really about how we construct our lived experience, how we construct our conscious selves. At the same time, there are people that are taking a really interesting look at Montessori education. In particular, there are a couple of books here that I might point you to that you might find interesting. Intellectual Agency and Virtue Epistemology, a Montessori perspective. I don't care if you're a Montessori teacher or not. There are great insights here. The Bloomsbury Handbook of Montessori Education is another one. And finally, if you just kind of want a fun introduction to this stuff, there's a neat TED Talk by Anil Seth called How Your Brain Hallucinates Your Conscious Reality. Go give it a look. It's just kind of cool. That's what we're about. Trying to take a new, profound, unifying understanding of the brain, of neuroscience, and use it to change the way, to clarify the way that we think about the classroom, to think about education. That's what the predictive classroom is about. But we're not the ones who have to do this. We're at the very start of this journey. To bring this to fruition, we need you to start looking at your world in this way, to start looking at your teaching practices, at your students, at your classrooms, and looking at them through a perspective processing lens, then joining a discussion of what you're finding. The whole idea of this is that we construct our worlds, and the worlds that we construct together are far richer than the worlds that we construct alone. So I hope that you will take a look. There's a discussion forum on the PredictiveClassroom.com, which is where you may well have found this video. Take a look at it. And join in, ask questions, contribute what you will. This is a deep insight into education, a deep insight into what it is to be human. Join us as we discover where that takes us.